Hi folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria. So we are here today talking about the Wallace Sword, that is the sword of William Wallace, famous Scottish hero of the end of the 13th century. And everybody knows, of course, that William Wallace had a huge freaking two-handed sword, sometimes known as a Zweihander, don't we? We all know that because we've all seen the film Braveheart. Except that he probably didn't have a sword, anything like that at all. As I mentioned in a recent video of mine, the use of two-handed swords in the late 13th century is extremely dubious. Long swords did just exist, so let's make a slight differentiation there between long swords and two-handed swords. What I've got here, which comes up to my chin, is very much a two-handed sword. This, sometimes known as a bastard sword or a hand-and-a-half sword, or indeed a long sword, is very much a different thing because you can wear a long sword at your side. You cannot wear one of these at your side because they're too big and too heavy. Now, William Wallace, did he have a massive two-handed sword? Almost certainly not. We can almost, I won't say 100%, but we can say 99.9% certain that William Wallace did not have a giant two-handed sword, for the very simple fact that it wasn't really a weapon at that date. If we're talking about the 1280s, 1290s, the large two-handed swords only debatably existed as bearing swords. Bearing swords were literally swords that were carried like that before a procession. There are a few of these surviving. There's one in Arundel Castle, there's one in Westminster Abbey, I believe. And these are, the ones that we know about, are very well documented, and we know what they were made for. They even appear in old inventories and accounts and described as bearing swords, ceremonial swords. For all of the Brits out there, if you ever watch debates in Parliament, or indeed opening of Parliament, you'll see there's a big two-handed sword used sometimes. That is a bearing sword. These were used for state occasions. They weren't used as weapons, and they were literally a giant longsword. So they take a normal longsword or even a one-handed sword and they make it giant. And this is for ceremonial purposes. They weren't used as weapons. And in fact many of them are just simply too heavy and too big to be used as weapons. However, Victorian antiquarians often looked at these things and thought, that must have been used by an immensely strong and massive knight. No, actually, if you look in the sources, if you look back in the original medieval and Renaissance sources, and the records that refer to these exact swords, the ones that still exist, like in Westminster Abbey, that we know exactly what they've been doing all of that time, we know that they were made for ceremonial purposes and kept for ceremonial purposes and have only ever been used for ceremonial purposes. So now we come back to William Wallace. Yes, it is slightly possible that he might have used a long sword of a type 13, it's probably something like that, type 13 blade in Oakeshot's typology. It's possible that he might have had a hand-and-a-half sword, aka long sword, at the end of the 13th century. They were a relatively new weapon. They only started appearing in medieval manuscripts, in artwork of that period, around that time, and they're not common at all. The common default sword, knightly sword, and remember that William Wallace was essentially an aristocrat. He was from knightly class, and he wasn't a savage running around in a kilt. He was essentially a gentleman, and most people of that social class used a one-handed sword as their sidearm. But it is true that it's possible that he might have had a long sword at that time. However, it's certain that he wouldn't have had a freaking huge Zweihander. Now we come specifically to the sword known as the Wallace Sword. And I will put a link below this video, right down here, which gives a link to Wikipedia of all things. I know it's not the most academic of publications, but it has a fairly concise and well-written article that will give you the outlines of the history of the Wallace Sword. You can additionally, of course, search for the Wallace Sword or William Wallace Sword in Google, and you'll come up with various other articles, some of them more academic, some of them more scientific, looking at that very sword. But to sum up, essentially, the William Wallace Sword is certainly not his sword. in its current form. We know for a fact that in 1505, in the beginning of the 16th century, the hilt of that sword was refurbished or replaced, and it specifically says the replacement of the pommel and fitting of a new hilt. And we can clearly see, if we look at the William Wallace sword, the so-called William Wallace sword, it is a 16th century hilt. It is not a 13th century sword. It is not a 14th century sword. It is not even a 15th century sword. It is without a doubt a sword hilt that dates after the end of the 15th century. So almost certainly this record we have from 1505 of King James asking for the hilt of the Wallace sword to be replaced, that hilt that you see today is probably that hilt that occurs in that historical document. It probably dates to 1505. Possibly even slightly later. It could be that the 1505 hilt was then subsequently replaced in 1520, because the hilt that we see today could equally date from about 1520. Now the blade, you may say, okay, so if the hilt was replaced in 1505 or sometime in the 1500s, maybe the blade is really William Wallace's sword. Well, there's one very good reason why that blade is probably not, in its current form, William Wallace's sword, a sword blade. And that is because it's not a functional sword blade. It's made of, it seems to be made of, 3 separate pieces of metal that have been relatively skillfully forge welded together to make a larger object. You see what's going on here? So, yes, it is possible that there is a piece of metal inside the blade of the so-called William Wallace sword that is, or was, William Wallace's sword. However, it will only ever be a piece of that blade that you see now. So whilst the blade on that sword is a great big Zweihander, the original sword certainly wasn't that big. And quite simply, we know that William Wallace did have a sword that was given to him as a gift, and again it's detailed in the Wikipedia article and other articles you can look up. So it is possible that one of the pieces of steel that went into the making of what we now see as the so-called William Wallace sword does come from William Wallace's original sword, or one of them. And yes, that is possible, and we will never know. The only possible way I can think of finding out is actually to look at the microscopic structure of the pieces of steel that are in that blade, the blade as it survives now, made of different pieces of steel, and see if any of those might fit with a possible 13th century type of blade steel. However, if it did, if one of those pieces of steel, or all of those 3 pieces of steel, do look like they could be 13th century steel, first of all, there's not a big difference between 13th century steel and 16th century steel, but secondly, you will never know that that 13th century piece of steel was actually William Wallace's sword. It could have been someone else's. So, it's very problematic, but what we can say is that what you now see as William Wallace's sword was certainly not William Wallace's sword. Yes, there may be a piece of metal somewhere in it that were related to one of William Wallace's swords, but his sword certainly did not look like a big 16th century Zweihander, two-handed sword. It would have either looked like an arming sword, like a single-handed sword of the late 13th century, or it possibly was a bastard sword, hand-and-a-half sword, but it wouldn't have been a giant two-hander. There we go, guys. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and feel free to follow us on Facebook.